Good evening, everyone. I'm Sonia Coupry, and I am pleased to welcome you to this session of the Café scientifique of Institut Français. Tonight, we are welcoming Antoine Stier. Antoine Stier, you are a young and talented French researcher, and you're specialized in ecophysiology, which, from what I understand, is trying to understand the physiological responses of individuals to climate change. And along with the universities of Strasbourg, Aberdeen, and Turku in Finland, you are part of a project with the French Polar Program called 119 Eco-Energy, which is conducted in the sub-Antarctic archipelago of Crozet. And this research program is devoted to understanding the physiological and behavioral adaptations used by the king penguin to cope with the various constraints of its environment in a context of global change. So tonight, we are very lucky because you're going to tell us more about what you observed during this research. And we are going to listen to you. And just for the public, please feel free to ask any questions during the presentation in the Facebook chat, and Antoine will try to answer them along his presentation. It's up to you, Antoine.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present a bit of my work and the work of plenty of colleagues about king penguin. So the talk of today is entitled Hot Penguin, Cool in the Water to Hot on Land. So the risk, I will speak a bit about the risk and the consequences of heat stress in penguins facing climate change. But first of all, I will try to explain you why and how we study king penguins, then talk a bit about the problematic of endothermy and heat stress, and finally present why we think that penguins, especially king penguins, will be at risk of heat stress. So first of all, Sonia already introduced me a bit, but I'm an ecophysiologist, being interested in metabolism, stress, and aging. I did my PhD at the University of Strasbourg, but before that, my master in ecophysiology, studying sea turtles and rats, so very far from penguin. Then did my PhD about cellular aging and animal life history in various models. So you can see there is the penguin, which was a very small part, but I worked with mouse and small birds, both in the wild and in the lab. Then I worked at the University of Angers, in the western part of France, this time with ectotherms, so snakes and newts, about the impact of environmental stress on cellular aging. I then moved to the University of Glasgow in Scotland, to conduct a project funded by the European Union about the prenatal programming of metabolism and aging. And finally, since 2018, I'm a research fellow at the University of Turku. And I'm working with three main species, so king penguins that we talk today, but also pied flycatcher and gray tits about the environmental and hormonal determinants of metabolism and aging. So as you can see, a scientific career involves moving a lot and usually far from the sun. So I went from France to Scotland to Finland. So why do we study king penguins? First of all, just because they're amazing. So I don't know if you can realize, but each small dot here in this colony in Crozet is a penguin. So let's zoom in. Let's zoom in. So they are a very atypical biological model. So it's an emblematic species being adapted to severe environmental constraints. So among them, they live in a very aggressive social environment. So they are very close to each other, but that's not a reason for them not to fight. Exactly the opposite. They are submitted to a high parasite pressure. So you can see, I will try to have the pointer here, that's ticks. So ticks are also quite common in subantarctic islands. The chicks face a high predation risk, partly by this guy, so the Antarctic petrel. They have to alternate between phases of life being in the water and phases being on land. And on land, they suffer from a terrible weather, so it's really wet and windy. They have a unique and quite complex life cycle. So I will try to guide you a bit through this life cycle that spans the entire year. So in October, November, the start of the spring in the southern hemisphere, they come on land to molt, so to renew their plumage. Then they will go back at sea and come back to parade. So that's when they choose their mate. Once the mate is chosen, like they will like copulate and then lay an egg. Once the egg is laid, like the male will keep the egg on land for up to like 3-4 weeks, while the females will go back at sea to like feed, and then they will switch. So one is going at sea to feed, while the other one is taking care of the egg. And then later, when the chicks hatch, so the chick is this little creature looking a bit like a dinosaur. So then always one parent with the chick, the other one feeding at sea. Later on, more in April, May, when the chicks will be a bit bigger, they will like form groups that we call crèche, which is a really French word, but there is no English equivalent. And then both parents will go back at sea and come only very occasionally to feed the chick. So the chick can like fast, so not have food for like up to like 3 to 4 months. And then only after that, the parents will come back during the beginning of the second spring to like feed the chick. And then the chick will be like large enough to like change his plumage from this brownish plumage to the adult plumage and go back at sea. So we study king penguins partly because they're likely to be impacted by climate change in various ways. So there have been some studies by a collaborator working now also at the University of Turku, but being French, Romain Cristofari, about the impact that climate change is predicted to have related to like the abundance of fish they can find in the ocean. So that's the situation. So the fish are found more or less now at this latitude, but with climate change, the fish will move back. We move like more south to find like cooler water. And this will be a problem for penguins because they will have trouble to reach like further distance from their breeding ground. So that's just some example. So that's the projected foraging distance. So the distance they have to cover to find the fish, like end the year with the predicted climate change. So this distance will like increase, and it might be a limitation because it might be like too far for the penguins to go back in time to feed the chicks and raise their partner. The king penguins, where do they live? So they live in subantarctic islands. So here you have Antarctica, and all of these small dots with like some orange color are islands that king penguins breed on. And I'm working in Crozet Island. So the image that we have like of penguins, like king penguins being on the snow in Antarctica, it's not a real one because like this one like would be like the emperor penguin breeding in Antarctica. Most of the time, the king penguins will be more like during the breeding season, at least on landscape being looking like that. So with some green and no ice. So where do we study them? We study them in the French Southern Territories. So there are like several islands, and we are focusing our work in the archipelago of Crozet, and more specifically in the Île de la Possession, where there is a permanent like research station. So that's the main colony of the island that we are studying. It's the Baie du Marin colony. So it's approximately like 25,000 breeding pairs, so up to 50,000 penguins. And you can see that it's quite a large colony, and there are like some like human infrastructure, both for research, and that's the fuel tank for like providing like energy to the field station being above the hill. We have like quite good facilities like very close to the penguin colony for being able to study them. How do we go there? So you don't have to be seasick because it's quite a long trip, like by boat. So the boat is called the Marion Dufresne, and it lasts like approximately like 1 week to go there, but 3 weeks to 5 weeks to go back. So we have quite good living conditions there. So there are like people all year round on the island. During the summer, there are more people. So approximately like 40 people with both scientists, like field assistants, but also like military people and people being in charge of like taking care of the infrastructure. So we really have good conditions for studying like penguins in such a remote site. So that's an overview of like the field station being on top of the hill above the king penguin colony. So we can study king penguins thanks to the support from the French Polar Institute. So the French Polar Institute organized the logistics for scientific research in polar region. So they choose and fund scientific programs for 1 to 4 years for all on-site operation. They fund one field assistant to conduct operation on site all year round because permanent scientists or even like PhD students we usually don't have the time to stay the entire year, while, as I explained before, the life cycle of the penguin takes all year round. And then the scientific program are led by like university lecturer or like CNRS researcher. So what are the methods we use to study penguin? So the first method is a very simple one. It's observation. So we look at the penguin and we can determine, for instance, the date of reproduction, if they are successful or not in reproduction, the time they spend at sea in between incubation or putting the chicks, and we study a lot their behavior. We can measure like morphometrics, like such as the size of the mass. Here you have a picture when we measure like the circumference of the thorax as an indicator of like body mass and fat store. We check like how fast the chick is growing, the amount of parasites, and like, for instance, the color of the sexual ornament. So this orange spot that you have on the side of the beak and the side of the head. Then we also use like some externally attached loggers. So for instance, this is like a heart rate monitor. So it's like the kind of watch that you can like see like that people doing jogging do. Like we have like the emitter like being in the back of the penguin and the watch either being attached to like something outside or even attached to like the flipper of the penguin when they are on land. We can measure heart rate. Yes.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I have a question looking at these pictures because you said there were about 50,000 penguins. And here apparently I don't know if it's tattooed or you've picked some of them. How do you choose them? How do you choose the ones that you will observe and measure and things like this?
So it's relatively a random choice. So every year we are monitoring approximately like 80 breeding pairs. So out of the 25,000. So when we choose them according to location, so we choose them mostly in the like outskirts of the colony, not to disturb too much the colony when we are entering to measure them. So usually we'll take the one being on the outskirts and then we mark them with like a hair dye. There will be some picture later on, or like in the video maybe. But yes, it's a bit like random choice, but after that they are marked both like externally with hair dye and internally with a small like pit tag. So the same kind of like identification you have for domestic cats, dog, or horses.
Okay, thanks.
So to study them a bit more in details for their physiology, we use like blood sample. So that's a picture of me being way younger, was in 2014, like taking a small blood sample using a syringe. So we take it from the flipper. So it's a bit like taking like from us in the arm. And then from this blood sample, we can assess their energy status. So a bit like you when you're going to the doctor, like the glucose, the triglyceride. We are interested in hormones as well, especially one corticosterone being the stress hormone. In cellular aging by measuring factors such as like oxidative stress or like telomere, like shortening. So telomeres are the end cap of the chromosomes and they shorten when we age, but this shortening is accelerated by life stress. And we are interested in metabolism. So like mitochondria are like the powerhouse of the cells. So they convert like nutrient and oxygen to ATP, which is a form of energy being available to the cell for like doing many of its functions. So we study king penguin like as part of the long-term like a polar program being funded by the French Polar Institutes and being led by the Department of Ecology, Physiology, and Ethology in Strasbourg. This was initiated in 1973 by René Groscola, who was then joined by Jean-Patrice Robin in 1990. They were mostly focusing on like the ability of penguins to fast for long periods because the adults can fast for like up to 50 days and the chicks for periods up to like 3 months. Then Vincent Viblanc, the current like leader of this project, joined in 2008 as a PhD student. And he was mostly interested in like the social stress penguin experience when they are on land. And then like Pierre Bies and Quentin Schul joined the program being interested in the sexual ornament and the individual quality. So sexual ornaments would be like this orange spot that you can see on the beak and on the side of the head, but also like the beak has like some UV like color that we don't see that penguins use to choose their mates. And I joined the program in 2014, just after defending my PhD, introducing a more like aging component to like this long-term study program. So now, what do we want to study for the next 4 years? We just have been renewed by the French Polar Institute, and the next question we want to explore is related to heat stress and climate change. With climate change, we have a rise in the average temperature, but we also have a rise in the extreme climatic events, such as like heat waves. So that's just an example of like a recent scientific publication showing a high mortality among birds and bats during an extreme heat event in Eastern South Africa. Heat stress indeed is mostly studied in warm countries, seems logical, such as Australia and South Africa. But we have been observing in our penguin colony that king penguins show signs of heat stress. Over the past decades, it happened every year. So king penguins, as all birds and mammals, are endotherm. So in more like public term, they are warm-blooded. They have like a quite high body temperature. So now I will expose a bit like what is endothermy and heat stress. So endothermy is the physiological generation and regulation of body temperature by metabolic means. A typical example of an endotherm would be like a mammal, such as the mouse. So across an environmental temperature from 0 degree to 40 degree, we are able to maintain our body temperature stable. In the case of human, usually it's 37 degree. While ectotherm, like they will just follow environmental temperature. The situation is a bit more complex, of course, like always in science, but we'll keep that endotherm. They maintain their body temperature stable. That's quite a complicated like illustration, but I will try to guide you through. So in the bottom, we have the environmental temperature from low to high. Like endotherms, they have what we call a thermoneutral zone. So that's the zone where you don't have to produce heat, or you don't have to like evacuate heat because you're too warm. So that's the zone we are very comfortable. Then there is a zone of homeothermy. That's the zone that we can maintain our body temperature, for instance, in the case of human, to 37 degrees. And if we go above this zone, it's the zone of survival. So basically our temperature will drop, like we'll be in hypothermia if it's too cold, or our temperature will increase, we'll be in hyperthermia if the temperature is too warm. And then we can either die from heat or die from the cold. So defining heat stress is like quite complex, but heat stress can be defined as an environment that acts to drive the temperature above a set point temperature. So as soon as you need to actively dissipate heat, that's characterizing heat stress. So it's a bit different from hyperthermia, because it occurs before like hyperthermia occurs. Animals and humans have a lot of like adaptation to deal with like high temperature. The first way could be to dissipate heat, for instance, by increasing heat loss through peripheral blood flow. So by running the blood like more toward the extreme, in the case of like this hair in the ears, we can evacuate quite a lot of heat. We can dissipate heat by evaporative cooling as well. So we are like, as humans know, like used to like sweating when it's too warm. But a lot of animals are not sweating, but they are instead like panting. So they will like breathe quite heavily. And like I have an example here, like of a penguin in a zoo, like being panting. So it will like open the beak and breathe like deeply. And it will like basically use water vapor in the breathing to try to cool down. Another way to avoid the heat is like by behavioral adaptation. So you can see like animals on this slide, like so sheep, like using the shadow of like a wind turbine when it's like too warm. Penguins, we know that some of them will go like put the feet in the water to like cool down when it's too warm. And there have been some suggestions as well that some animals that are like usually active during the day, if with climate change, it's becoming way too warm during the day, they might switch and become nocturnal. And finally, another way to like deal with the heat is to be able to tolerate phases of hyperthermia. So we know that as humans, we are 37 degrees, but we can tolerate a bit more. For instance, when we have fever, we are like 38, 39, up to 40. Animals, it's the same. And some animals, some birds especially, have really high ability to like maintain like to still survive at very high body temperature. For instance, the small bird from South Africa, the red-billed killer, can have a temperature up to 48 degrees and still being able to eat, to fly. So there are a lot of changes associated with global changes for endotherm. So first of all, living in an environment being overall warmer, but also being exposed to increasing heat wave frequency, which could lead to heat stress. Having more restricted access to water, which will not help with heat stress because water is important to cool down. So we know that when we're like sweating a lot, we need to drink. And the penguins and other animals, when they're panting, they need to drink as well. But it's also possible that with global change, like some animals will become too cold. It will happen in a region where it was used to snow and it will start to rain instead. And this already happened in like Antarctica with like Adelie penguins, because the chicks are used to the snow, but not to the rain. And in 2014, there was this extreme climatic event when it was raining, when the chicks were small, and basically they all died. For characterizing heat stress, we can look at the behavioral response of the animals. So for instance, I will just show you a small immersion, like in a king penguin colony, like to look a bit at all the kind of behavior we can observe. So first of all, you can hear that it's quite a noisy environment. And you see that like there is a penguin being marked, as I mentioned before, that the hair dies. It's penguin 25 in front of us. Just by observing the behavioral response, we can figure if the penguins are suffering from heat stress, so if they are panting wide open, or if they are like extending the flipper, like to try to cool down. To characterize heat stress, we can measure body temperature. So that's something that is not necessarily easy in wild animal, because you cannot just shade them with a thermometer. But we have ways of measuring like temperature, either with like small like logger that we can implant below the skin, or even with like small pit tag, like the one that I use for like just marking the animal, that will record body temperature for us. And recently, like infrared imaging with infrared camera has also been used for measuring like body temperature. We can characterize heat stress by measuring metabolic rates and evaporative water loss by putting an animal in this like a setup where we will measure like oxygen before and after the chamber the animal is in. But the thing that in the wild, it's really not practical. So for our penguin, it could not be practical, but we can measure, like use other methods. And for instance, we are using like heart rate as an index of like metabolism. And finally, one thing being important would be to measure like dehydration, because the penguins facing heat stress will be at risk of being dehydrated. And the more we are dehydrated, the more we are at risk of like dying from like heat stroke. And we can measure that from like the blood sample we are taking from the penguin. So from the plasma, from the liquid fraction of the blood, we can measure osmolality, which is an indicator of like dehydration. And from the blood cells, we can measure like some very specific protein, being heat shock proteins, that will tell us if the penguins are suffering from heat stress or not. We can wonder if all species are equally susceptible to heat stress. And the response is clearly not. So we can see on this illustration that we have like two bird species from like South Africa. And then that's their body temperature in response to like an increasing ambient temperature. And while both species like show like hyperthermia quite quickly, one species can tolerate way higher temperature than the other. So the susceptibility to heat stress will depend on a lot of factors, but body size is like one important factor. Because with the surface of our body, we are losing heat, while with the volume of our body, we are producing heat. And small animals have quite a large surface compared to the volume, so they will be more easily able to dissipate heat than large animals. So that's why large animals are way more at risk of suffering from heat stress than small ones. And it will depend on the evolutionary history of the animals as well. So here, as an example, you can see like three like closely related species. They are all like fox, but we have the Arctic fox being really used. So it has evolved in an environment being cold, with like, for instance, like very small ears to like avoid to lose heat to like blood circulation in the ear. like the regular fox we have more in our like temperate region, and then like the fennec fox being like used to like the very arid and desertic environment with these very long ears to be able to dissipate heat. There's a strong, yes.
Sorry, I still have a question. I wanted to know what was how you make the difference between the reaction to an extreme climatic event and the long-term adaptation to the climate change, because it's changing slightly over the years, but it's not very regular, and it can. So how do you interpret the reactions of the how do you interpret the science in the physiologic changes depending on that?
On the long term and the short term. So it's true that climate change is like so it's a very rapid process considering like the time, like in our history, but it's a very slow process when you study it. So for instance, if we measure like something in 2010 and 2020, it will be quite difficult to tie it up to like climate change directly. But we know that climate change increases the occurrence of these heat waves. So they are way more frequent and like they're way warmer. So that's one of the reasons we are focusing more on these heat waves, because they might be more dangerous for animals because they really don't have time to like adapt. But yeah, that's a very good question. So yeah, there is a strong focus on animals from hot, arid environments, but climate change is more pronounced towards the pole. So like polar regions are like warming up faster than like temperate region. Moreover, animals adapted to cold climates have quite poor capacities to dissipate heat because they were not used in their evolutionary history to deal with like such warm temperature. Okay. Then there might be a dual challenge of being warmer in summer and colder in winter if the snow is like converted to rain. And animals are larger towards the pole, so that's a very old like ecological rule known as Bergmann's rule. And that's an issue because, like, as I told you before, bigger animal like will have more trouble to dissipate heat. So now I will try to explain to you why we think that king penguins might be especially vulnerable to heat stress. So that's the project that will run for the next 4 years. So it's mostly like, for instance, a project, and we have so far very few data to present, but king penguins have to alternate between phases in cold water. So the water is approximately like 4 degrees, and phases on land to take care of their eggs or their chicks. So usually it's not that warm, but it can be up to like 25 degrees. And in the past decade, we have been observing like approximately like more than 10 days where temperature was above 20 degrees. The thing is that since they have to live in this cold water, they are very well insulated. They have very good plumage, like to resist in cold water. And it's impossible for them to modify such insulation whether they come back like on land for like 1 week or a few weeks to take care of the egg of the chick. Moreover, the king penguins are like very large birds, so they weigh approximately like 12 to 15 kilograms. So they have quite a low surface to volume ratio, which is convenient when you want to preserve heat when you're facing cold temperatures, such as being in the water. But it limits the ability to dissipate heat when you face high temperature. They also have quite limited thermal windows to dissipate heat. So we can see here like a picture taken with an infrared camera of penguin like being inside like the scientific facility. So the ambient temperature was like 20 degrees. And we can see that most of the penguin surface will be around like 8 to 10 degrees, and they only dissipate heat through the beak, the eye, and the flipper. So that's a very small surface to be able to like dissipate heat. Additionally, for the king penguins, it's impossible to move when they are breeding. When they are taking care of the egg or the chick, they are stuck basically in their very small territory, being less than 1 meter, like that less than 1 square meter. Consequently, they cannot use water to cool down. They cannot go just at sea for like a few minutes to cool down, or they cannot go to the river being nearby just to put the feet to cool down. Additionally, they cannot move to find like shadow, because there is not a lot of shadow on these islands, but there is still a bit, but they cannot use that as a strategy to like cool down. Additionally, they live in this very dense and highly aggressive social environment. So it's difficult to realize how aggressive they are, but I can tell you like, and this graphic can tell you how aggressive they are. So that's the number of aggression, like aggressive behavior per hour. Okay, so it's like going from 0 to 150. So they have more than 100 aggression per hour, being just like threatening the neighbor. And they have approximately like 25 times per hour when they fight with the neighbor. And this physical activity will increase their metabolism and will further increase their body temperature. So this will accentuate the risk for the penguin to die from heat stroke.
I have a question, and it's good that we see the calendar here. I was wondering, then because of this, have you noticed or observed a change in the dates for the breeding season? So because that could be an adaptation, so that they go in the colder season to breed.
Yes, so that could be like an adaptation, but unfortunately, so far we don't see any change in the dates they start breeding. And one of the reasons is probably because their life cycle, so it's so long that it's very constrained, because the winter, the weather is still like terrible. So they have to make the best of the summer for like incubating the egg and having the chick, and having the chick being ready for the winter, so being big enough. So that might constrain them and not able then like to like switch to like breed like later on or like earlier on to when it's like a bit cooler.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So since they have to spend these long phases on land when they are like fasting and not drinking, because surprisingly they don't drink and they don't have a lot of opportunity to drink except when it's raining. But usually when it's raining, it's not too warm. And they fast for approximately like 4 weeks when they're incubating the eggs, and then approximately 2 weeks a bit later on. So the increased metabolism, the increased energy expenditure they will have like during this heat wave might decrease their ability to fast for a long period. And we can see on this picture, like in green, one penguin having quite good fat store and another penguin being quite emaciated, so having very little like a fat store. And fat store is really important because since they have to fast until the partner is coming back to like take care of the egg or the chick, if the fat store is too low, they will just abandon the egg or the chicks and go back at sea to favor their own survival. Okay, so like our approach to study heat stress will first be like what we call a correlative approach. So we'll use like long-term data sets we have like gathered because we are going there every year since like 1973. And most of the data we use has started to be like accumulated since like early 2010. And we'll use natural heat waves because they happen every year. So we already have samples, for instance, blood samples or data on their reproduction that we can use to investigate if these like periods of heat wave have like consequences on the physiology of the bird and their ability to like successfully reproduce. And what we are doing like starting this year is to measure like their body temperature, measure the heat shock proteins that are indicative of heat stress, measure their hormonal response. So for instance, we are interested in particularly into hormones. So like the corticosterone being a bit the stress hormones. Usually when this hormone is going up, they have more risk of like abandoning reproduction. And we are also interested in prolactin being more the hormone of parental care. So usually these hormones, when it's high, they will stay on land, take care of the chick or the egg. But when it's going down, they are at risk of like abandoning their reproduction. We are investigating like if the penguins are dehydrated, because since they don't drink, we really have no idea if they're sensitive to like dehydration or not. This has not been investigated because usually it's like raining so much and the weather is so poor that we figure out that they could be dehydrated, but we have already observed some cases with like penguins like suffering from dehydration. And measuring like penguin survival in the long term is like quite a challenging task because they live for up to like 20, 25 years. So as a proxy of the survival, we're measuring their biological age using like these telomeres, so the end caps of the chromosome. And then we look at the organismal effects. So we're focusing on their reproductive success. So we are looking if they are able to like maintain and incubate the egg, if they are able to raise the chick, and if the chick is able to survive until fledging. Because the chick, from the day it's hatched from the egg, it will take 11 months for the parents to raise the chick. So it's a very long cycle. It's very unusual for birds and for animals of this size. So with that, we hope to determine the upper thermal limits of penguins, like until what temperature, until what environmental condition they can tolerate, and what's the limit for them to suffer from heat stress, to determine like the impact it will have and the physiological cost it will have, and the cost it can have for their reproduction. And all that combined, the aim is to improve like and inform conservation, like because a lot of penguin species are threatened. So king penguins, it's not the case yet. So the species is still considered as like, okay, the population is stable, but with climate change, there are like strong prediction that the population will collapse, and heat stress, like being linked to heat wave, could be one of the factors leading like to like the population collapse of king penguins in the next century. Then as scientists, usually we like to like use experimental approaches. So in this case, for studying heat stress in penguin, it will be either inducing heat stress or reducing it. For obvious ethical reason, we will not induce heat stress in penguins, but we might try to like reduce heat stress. So of course, we will not put some small sweater to the penguin. This has been done in Australia for like a wrong reason, and that was a failure. It was for like protecting them, and they were overheating. And by reducing heat stress, like our aim is to see how it can improve their behavior and their physiology, and how it can improve their reproduction. And for that, we'll conduct some small experiments using like some cooling mats that have been designed usually for domestic pets, mostly dogs, like to help them when there are like heat waves. And we'll try to use this like a cooling mat with the penguins to see if it can help them to like cope with like heat waves. So with that, I'm at the end of my presentation, and I'm kind of okay in the time, a bit less than 40 minutes. And I have a lot of persons to acknowledge. So first of all, like all the members, like all the collaborators of the program. So I already showed a lot of pictures of like the historical program member, but Agnes Levden, who is like specialized in this like infrared camera, has been like really helpful with the project. And Suvi Ruskanen from the University of Turku, and now she moved to the University of Jyväskylä, has been instrumental to develop this project on heat stress in penguins as well. We have to thank like many field assistants, because as I mentioned in the introduction, a lot of the work is not done by like permanent scientists, but by people going there as like field assistants, and they stay on the island for 6 months to like a bit more than 1 year. And you can see that there has been quite a number since 2008 that we have started to collect this data. And then I have to thank the people making it possible in terms of like finance and logistics, like the French Polar Institute, the University of Turku, the University of Turku Foundation, who fund like part of this project, and then like the European Union, who is funding my salary currently, and both the University of Strasbourg and the University of Lyon. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this was not too dense and not too quick, but hopefully you gathered the message like that king penguins are at risk of heat stress, and that we will be focusing on that for the next 4 years.
Well, thank you very much, Antoine, for this very interesting presentation. I was wondering, because you're working also with the University of Turku in Finland, and it's quite. You would think that they are closer to the North Pole than the South Pole, and so what is the parallel that can be done between the what information does the penguin observation tell us about the change elsewhere and maybe in the northern part of the hemisphere.
Yes, so it's true that Finland is way closer to the North Pole than like to the subantarctic islands. The thing is that's related to heat stress. It's happening as well in the North Pole, but historically, in terms of climate, like close to the North Pole, like the climate during summer is like way warmer than in like the South Pole. So that's why like heat stress might be like more easily detectable in the South Pole at the moment. But if penguins are actually suffering from heat stress, which we like strongly like believe, like this could be informative, for instance, in terms of methods that can be used to monitor this heat stress in wild animal, like closer to the North Pole and, for instance, in the northern part of Finland. And actually, we have started to do like stuff on like heat stress, like not necessarily in the polar region, but even like close to Turku with like the birds that we are studying there. And it seems that even like moderate increase in temperature during this breeding season. So we did that with like gray tits breeding in nest boxes. And like by warming a bit the nest boxes during the breeding season, it has quite a strong impact, for instance, on their rate of aging.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question. Maybe it's too disconnected, but never doesn't matter. I was wondering, I learned that for turtles, the temperature of the sand where the eggs are laid determines the gender of the turtles that will hatch. So I was wondering if the temperature change would have an effect on the gender of the penguins.
So the turtles and like quite a few reptiles, so the sex determination is indeed like temperature dependent. So which is a problem with like climate change, because it's possible that the population will become like way like more female biased or male biased depending on species. Mm-hmm. In penguins, in birds, like in humans, the sex is determined by the chromosome. So in theory, it should not be a risk, but we know that like depending on the sex, they will be more or less sensitive when they are like embryo in the egg, and that the mortality of the embryo in response to high temperature might be sex specific. So part of the work I did in Glasgow was with this incubation temperature. And when you have like high incubation temperature, which might happen with climate change, you have more mortality of the females in birds. So it's not fully impossible. And that's something that we might actually like investigate in the coming years.
Okay. And also in the longer term, because you told us that the next step of the research will help trying to see the conservation or the species conservation rate. But what does it tell us in the long term about for humans? What does it tell us? This research, what does it bring apart from the very specific knowledge for the penguins, which is crucial, but also for humans? What does it tell us?
So, like one thing that might be interesting with the penguin model is like to have a parallel with human. Is this temperature aggression hypothesis, because in human, we know that when you have high temperature, people are more aggressive, but there is like no good way to study it experimentally, what we can do with the penguins, because we suspect that like the aggressivity is related to temperature as well. But you're right that it's mostly like fundamental knowledge and informing like a conservation issue about the penguins. It's not purely focused on like a human or about bringing like any like application for like human, but there are always stuff we can like discover. For instance, like we can try to discover if they have like specific mechanism for coping with like heat stress, because we have discovered in the penguins that they have like specific mechanism for coping with like social stress, which is something that humans are experimenting as well, because we are not like programmed to like be living in such like a dense population. It's a bit less the case in Finland, but still. And we have discovered that they have like mechanism protecting their body from like the deleterious effect of like social stress. Because when you're stressed, you're aging faster. And that's seen like in humans, in some animal models, for instance, in laboratory, when you put mouse in the quite high density. And the mechanisms are like partly known, and we tested the same in penguins, and they have like some protective mechanism that that are protecting them from like these deleterious effects. So their response to heat stress might as well like inform us and maybe some specific way they have for dealing with that.
Okay, well, and just for the a small one with the you told us that you would try to see how they would how the penguins would react, for example, with the cooling mats. And don't you think that you will increase the social stress if you don't give enough cooling mats for all of them? And if they find out that it's a great thing.
That's why it's something that we'll like really test. So we'll do like a preliminary test like this season to see if it's feasible, if they are using them or not, because it's possible that they might be afraid of novel objects. But with penguins, they are usually they're not afraid. So if you're just sitting on the beach, they will come and see you, which is like quite rare for wild animals. But then, yeah, that's a good question. That if the neighbors are like start to be jealous, that's something that's really informative as well, because it might inform us about like how they select the place they want to be. So like for instance, if they can select spots being like less exposed like to like warm temperature, that might tell us as well like if they have opportunity to move, for the colony to move a bit like in different area. So that will be interesting for sure, but that's why we do like this initially with very small tests to see how it's going.
And is there a social hierarchy in the colony? No?
There is no real hierarchy, but usually the more competitive, the more aggressive we tend to be in the center of the colony, because they can secure the spot in the center. Because to go in the center, you have to fight a lot of penguins on your way. And when you will have to go back at sea, you will have to fight them again, and to come back to fight them again. So the one in the middle like are more exposed to like social stress, but they are less exposed to predators, because the predators, they cannot land in the middle of the colony because they will be attacked by all the penguins. So they have this crazy life that, you know, they are like really dense, but they are fighting for their small territory, but without their close neighbors that they are fighting all day long, they could not survive either. So it's really a trade-off between the benefits of being close to your neighbors and the cost. So they need like approximately like a bit less than 1 square meter to be okay. But as soon as someone is invading, they will attack.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for this presentation and all these elements. And what is the next step? The next step? Are you going back to Crozet? And
so
if so, when?
I'm not going back personally this year because I had a baby earlier this year, but like the leader of the project, Vincent Blanc, is currently in quarantine in La Réunion because they have to quarantine for 2 weeks. So the team, basically we have like 4 people going for like our program. So they are all in quarantine in La Réunion, and then they will go. So like with the shorter stay being like the leader of the program, because we have a lot of other duties as well, staying 1 month, and the longer one being like the field assistant, staying like for 13 months. So arriving there in November 2021 and leaving the island on December 2022.
Wow,
but
COVID has experience.
COVID has been making our like a scientific project more difficult, because last year we are not able to go. So there was only the field assistant being able to go. So we still have some minimal data collection, but usually we are like 4 to 5 people going every year for the peak of the season.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. And so we wish all the best to this project, and we hope that you can come back and tell us more about the results in a few years then.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot to everyone, and see you soon for a scientific cafe. Goodbye.